Hello! Can you all see and hear us?
Hi, guys.
Oh, I see some people who are calling in from Illinois, a cornfield in Illinois. I'm in Chicago, but I was in a cornfield last weekend. Awesome, Sherry. Thanks for making sure that you can see and hear us.
And I do notice, Danny, you are echoing just a little bit.
I'm echoing.
And I did mute myself to make sure that it wasn't me. So it could just be me. Folks who are you guys, go ahead and Danny, someone just say a few words and see if folks are hearing any echo.
Let's see what's going on here before we get started. It's good timing anyway. We can give people a few minutes to come in before we start.
Well, that's actually got better as you were speaking there. So I think we're okay.
Yeah, can you guys hear an echo over in the chat? Is it just us? You do hear an echo, okay. Buenos Aires.
Well, probably, I assume it'll improve. I'm only going to be on for the first couple of minutes, guys, and then I'm going to leave you in Danny's hands. And so I imagine the audio will probably be fine when it's just Danny.
Great. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight, taking time out of your evening for this. So for those of you who are just joining us, there's a chat over on the right-hand side of your screen. We would love for you to introduce yourself and let us know where you're calling from tonight.
I was glad to see all these folks signed up. We are not purely about novel writing. We have so many children's authors that are doing picture books and chapter books. So I wasn't quite sure, but it was great to see so many of you guys who are interested in working on a novel. So of course that could be middle grade, it could be young adult, could be an adult novel. But I was excited to see that. And I'm excited to see that you guys are pumped up for NaNoWriMo. A lot of familiar names to me as I look through the folks that are here. It's good to see you guys.
That's great. I look forward to getting to know you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I think we can go ahead and get rolling now that we're a couple minutes past the hour. I don't want to take too much time out of everybody's Tuesday night, so.
And Danny, just to be sure, you are recording this and you'll have a replay up for folks that are have problems or can't make it for the whole time. Okay,
exactly. Great. Yes. If you need to hop off for any reason, there will be a replay available. So
great. And Lisa is saying that she re-entered to gain her audio back. That's actually always a good idea. Restarting is the magic answer to all computer problems.
Turning it off and back on again.
Yep.
Well, John, do you want to kick us off? And
Sure. So I'm happy to do something. We've never actually done anything in all of our years around NaNoWriMo. Again, as I was just mentioning, because we weren't sure whether there were a lot of folks that were interested in doing it, but it turns out there are. So that's really exciting. So in looking for ways to get you ready to succeed at NaNoWriMo, and Danny will be talking more about what this actually is and how to get into it and all that sort of stuff. But we heard what Danny and the folks at Writing Academy were up to, and we're very excited about it. Writing Academy is just a great resource, terrific tools. We have a lot of respect for what they do. And because we don't have anything for NaNoWriMo, we wanted to have you guys meet somebody who is an expert in it and help you get ready for it. So that's why we have Danny Alcorn with us. Let me tell you just briefly about Danny. She is the Chief Operating Officer of Writing Academy, and she's also an author. She has a couple of nonfiction books about writing. Her books include Writing Young Adult Fiction, So those of you who are working on YA middle grade have a soulmate in your host tonight. Also, her other book is adapting novels to screenplay. And she's written some fiction as well, and some plays and a bunch of other stuff. So she is a true writer at heart, and she's going to really be able to connect with you and let you know exactly how to make the most of this incredible opportunity that's coming up in November. So I invite you right now just to kind of turn off your phones and whatever other distractions are going on, and just sit back and relax, because tonight is for you. And tonight is to get you excited and ready for a big challenge, and something I think that's going to really make your writing career even more wonderful. And I know that also Danny's going to be talking about something that they're doing that you could become part of to help you really succeed during NaNoWriMo. So with that, I'm going to log off and enjoy the show myself and leave you in the hands of Danny Alcorn. You got it, Danny.
Thanks so much, John. Well, thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your Tuesday night to join us for this. Like John said, this is a really fun challenge. It's a little daunting for a lot of authors, so that's why I'm here tonight to help you get ready to succeed at NaNoWriMo. First, before we dive into that, if you've just joined us, you'll probably see that over on the right-hand side, there is a chat bar that you can use to ask any questions throughout. If you are having audio or video problems at any point during this, I encourage you to log out and log back in of the broadcast. Now, like John said, my name is Danny Alcorn. I'm an author. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Writing Academy, and I've written a whole variety of nonfiction, fiction, screenplays, trained in screenwriting at Northwestern. That's kind of how I got my start into being a writer and interested in this. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Writing Academy, we are an online school and community, and we really share a lot of value with the community that John has built over with Writing Blueprints for aspiring authors and authors to really help you succeed and realize your writing dreams. We offer classes in fiction and nonfiction. My personal favorite genre is definitely young adult, which is why I'm so excited to be here with you tonight. I don't often get a chance to speak to predominantly young adult and children's authors, so this is really fun for me. And over the years, we've taught more than 30,000 students how to structure and publish their manuscripts. So check us out. We're at writingacademy.com. You find us on all our social channels and things like that. So a couple housekeeping things before I launch into the educational part of the presentation. First, I will stick around at the end of this to answer as many questions as you guys have. I will be here as long as you want to ask questions. That said, since I'm solo, it's a little bit harder for me to find them in the chat as I'm presenting. So jot them down, hang on to them, and then at the end, there will definitely be an opportunity to ask and answer all of those. I also encourage you to grab something to take notes with. The slides will be available along with the replay for this, but I'm going to cover a lot of material tonight, and I want to make sure that you walk away feeling confident. So this is a great time to take some notes. And if you need to revisit the replay to catch anything that you missed, that's fine. And then at the end, like John said, there is something that we have an exclusive offer for you tonight to help you level up your NaNoWriMo success and take it to the next level. So I encourage you to stick around for that. Okay, so before I dive into talking about how to succeed at NaNoWriMo, I have a couple of questions for you. So get ready to type over in the chat there. First, who has heard of NaNoWriMo? If you've heard of it, type yes. If you haven't, type no. Yes, yes, no, okay. No, no, yes, yes. All right, so a lot of you have, and there are a few people out there who aren't familiar with it. That's totally fine. We're going to talk about what NaNoWriMo is so that you know what you're getting into here. Second question for you, who is definitely planning to participate in the challenge? If you are already committed, type a yes over in the, yeah, I love to see that. It's such a great opportunity. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I'll talk about why I love NaNoWriMo so much in just a second. And then, is there anybody out there who is on the fence, who is thinking about it but hasn't decided for sure yet? Okay, Kathy, Linda, Karen. Well, I hope that by the time we finish this presentation, you will feel both inspired to participate and prepared to participate, which are really the keys to success. So Lisa, I hope by the end of this, you will know everything you're signing up for. And my other question, just so that I can kind of tailor this as we go. So as John said, there's a lot of you who are out there. Can you type YA or middle grade or something else if you are working in that, planning to write something that would be the project that you were working on this November? Middle grade, young A. Okay. Cozy mysteries. Those are great. I love those. Picture books. Okay. Cozies. Yeah, this is awesome. Romance, sci-fi, middle grade, young adult. We've got you covered. So that'll be great. And somebody's going for an adult novel. That's awesome. Yeah. All right. So for those of you who don't know, NaNoWriMo is an annual event. It happens every year in November, and it's basically a giant challenge across the world to write 50,000 words between November 1st and November 30th. It's free to participate. You can sign up at nanowrimo.org and claim your win by validating your word count on November 30th to verify that you participated in and completed the challenge. So there really aren't that many rules. The only rule is that you work on one project, you write 50,000 words, and that you do it between November 1st and November 30th. Other than that, the sky is kind of the limit. You can work on pretty much any genre that you want. You can work on young adult. You can work on middle grade. You could even do chapter books. You can do adult fiction. So any genre. Nonfiction is also completely acceptable to work on during it. It's really about the commitment of those 50,000 words during a very tight time frame. And 50,000 words is a pretty intimidating goal to face, especially in a time frame that is as condensed as 1 month. So given that, it's a valid question to ask, what does 50,000 words get you? Well, of course, it gets you serious bragging rights. But more importantly, it gets you a complete or almost complete manuscript. So it is a way in a very concentrated amount of time to take a huge leap forward towards your goals, whether it's to complete or revise a manuscript or whatnot. It is a way to establish daily writing habits or almost daily writing habits that will also set you up for success in the long run. So what we're here to talk about tonight is how to achieve success at this seemingly gargantuan task that honestly defeats a lot of writers every year. The completion rates, if you look at them for the entire Nano participant pool, are fairly low. And I think you can kind of guess why. It's that it's very easy to go in with great ambition and great ideas and keep it going for a week or two, but sustaining it throughout the entire month is quite challenging. And so that's what we're going to talk about. So the number one way to be successful at NaNoWriMo is to have a plan. Now, this plan actually is comprised of 2 parts. You'll need a plan for when you'll write, and you'll need a plan for what you'll write. And it breaks my heart when authors nail one of these without the other, because while it does increase either one of these obviously increases your chance of successfully completing the challenge. However, if you nail one without the other, either of them, you set yourself up for extra work in the long run. And I'll talk more about that as we get into it. But first, let's talk about the part 1 of your plan, when you'll write. This is perhaps the most obvious because you have to build a writing schedule, and it is essential that you are realistic about it. You have to actually pull up your calendar and look at it and figure out what days you will and won't be able to write. Because for most people, writing every day is overly ambitious, but you don't have to be able to write every day of November to participate in the challenge or even successfully complete the challenge. You just have to factor it into your plans so that you don't end up in the last week of the challenge suddenly realizing that a handful of missed writing days are going to make or break your ability to achieve the goal. So to give you an idea of what word count you'd be looking at, if you do write every day, and for some people this is completely achievable, if you write every day of November, you need to write 1,667 words a day to get to 50,000 by the end of the month. Now, if you factor in a few days here and there where you're not able to write, so that you're looking at approximately just weekdays, 20 days, then you're more at like 2,500 words a day. And if you have a 5-day-a-week job that you just know you're not going to be able to write on those days, it is possible to tackle this challenge only on the weekends. Just know that you're going to be upwards of 6,000 words a day for that. So it's going to be a hefty amount of work, but it is doable as long as you know what you're getting into and you have that time scheduled out. Now, when it comes to scheduling that time out, plan to write when you know that you will be the most productive. For instance, I am not a morning person, and a lot of the advice that I've heard over the years, or even that I come up with myself, is like, well, if I'm trying to come up, trying to fit something extra into my day, like writing 16, however many words, it's to get up an hour early. But if I were to do that, I would be grumpy and unproductive. So instead, when I try and do something like this, it's essential that I look for other times during the day. When I was just out of college and was working a 9-to-5 job, that time was often my lunch break. That would be a time where my brain was awake, it was ready to go, and I had the time to devote to a project. For some people, it could be after work. For some people, some people like big blocks of time that are actually scheduled off, where it's just like I've got 2 or 3 hours to sit down and write, and other people find that really intimidating. Last year, I was talking with a student who was doing the challenge, and she initially went in with the idea that she was going to set aside these giant blocks of time, and she'd just get paralyzed by the blank page and the feeling of this pressure. And so she came up with something that I thought was just brilliant. She called them writing sprints, basically. So she would literally set a timer for 10 or 15 minutes whenever she had a few minutes during the day, and she would just type as fast as she could for those 10 or 15 minutes, and then as soon as the timer went off, she'd wrap up whatever paragraph or sentence she was working on and go back to the rest of her day. But she'd just do that whenever there was sort of a natural break in her rhythm and she had a few minutes to spare. And then by the end of the day, she would have gotten up to her daily goal of words. And that's how she successfully completed the challenge. And that was an insight that she shared with us and some other Writing Academy students who were doing the November Novel Challenge together, which I just thought was a great idea. So the point is that you need to know yourself, you need to know when you will be productive so that you can use your very valuable time as productively as possible. And don't be afraid to adjust if you go in with one set of expectations and discover that it's not working for you. Rather than trying to, fit a square peg through a round hole, adjust midway through if necessary. Now, the plan for what you'll write is an even more important part, I think. And so I want to spend the bulk of our time tonight together giving you a story structure crash course. So this is the framework that Writing Academy uses to help students focus on the big picture arc of what story you're telling so that you never write yourself into a corner and end up having to unnecessarily backtrack or do massive edits when a little bit of upfront work can save you so much time and angst in the end. But the first thing that I need to clarify is how we define plot and how we define story. Because people who aren't writers tend to use these words interchangeably. But for us, I find there to be a vital difference between them. Because plot is physical and story is emotional. Now, another way to say that is that plot is your protagonist's physical journey. It's the stuff that's happening. It's how they get from point A to point B and the things that they do along the way. But story is your protagonist's emotional journey. It's how they're changing. It's how they're growing. It's what they're learning. And you can think of plot as action and story as reaction. This was kind of a light bulb moment for me when I was studying screenwriting, because you have this constant flow of action, reaction, action, reaction. And I realized it's the same in cinema as it is in novel writing, that you have this constant interplay between something that happens and how the character reacts emotionally to it, and how that changes them, how that forces them to grow. And the interplay between them shows why it is so vital to balance them, because too much of one or the other and you have an unsatisfying manuscript. You either have unrelenting action or you have something that just drags because nothing ever happens. So story lets us get to know your character, which is really important. But if you have too much, it can bog your novel down. So this balance is really vital. So if you look at some large, well-known properties, painting with broad strokes here, James Bond, I would call out as a series of books and movies that are very plot-heavy. There's a lot of explosions, there's a lot of really exciting action sequences, but we don't get to know Bond that well as a character over. We don't see him change or grow that much. On the flip side of that, if you take the Twilight series by Stephanie Meyer, wildly successful though it is, the first book especially is really heavy on the story. And there's not a lot of action that happens. And so some readers who've, go through that have trouble, especially with the first book, because there's nothing exciting to kind of keep things going. She's just stewing in her head for a lot of, especially the first part of the book. Now, I love to call out Harry Potter, the whole series, as being very well balanced in plot and story. Each volume of it has a compelling plot that is interesting and keeps you engaged, but it has very well realized characters in each volume. Harry grows, he develops, he learns, he changes. And so by the time you get to the end of that 7th book, you really feel like you've watched this young man go from being a child to being an adult. And so it is, what that comes down to is the balance of plot and story. So again, plot is physical and story is emotional. So with that in mind, let's talk about the 4 dramatic elements. And actually, if you guys would like to play along, I would love to use Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone as an example for this. So get ready over in the chat, and I'm going to have some questions for you after I explain each of these dramatic elements. So the first dramatic element is your passion, and that's your passion. It's why you want to tell your story. And it's what I call your writer fuel for any project, but especially something like NaNoWriMo, where the going is going to get tough by the end of the month. So you actually can write your passion down on a sheet of paper, stick it by your monitor, your computer, wherever, so that you see it. And if you're having a tough day and you're like, oh, I could not today, I'll just make it up tomorrow, look at that passion and remind yourself why it is you're telling this story. And why you're telling the story could be related to the actual story that you're telling. Like if you are particularly passionate about a cause, social justice, environmentalism, something like that, your passion could very closely align with what you're writing. However, your passion doesn't actually need to be that specific to your book. It could simply be that writing a book, publishing a book, seeing your name in print or your story on bookshelves is a goal that you've had your whole life, and that's why you want to write this book. That's a completely fine passion to have. It's whatever is going to fuel you. It's what's going to inspire you. It's what's going to remind you why you decided to do something as crazy as decide to write 50,000 words in a single month. So sometimes you can deduce an author's passion and sometimes you can't. However, the next dramatic element is the theme, and that is something that your readers will be able to deduce from your finished manuscript, because your theme is the big picture idea of what your manuscript is about. It's the kernel at the heart of it. It's the takeaway message. And themes can almost always be boiled down into very simple, straightforward elements. It's things like love conquers all, or the importance of believing in yourself. Chances are, if you're trying to explain what your theme is and it's taking sentences and sentences or paragraphs and paragraphs, you need to dig a little deeper and figure out what the real core of that message is. And what the theme grows out of is your character's flaw, your protagonist's story structuring flaw. Because your protagonist is not perfect on page 1 of your manuscript. Your protagonist has a lot to learn. And so they have this fundamental character flaw that prevents them from accomplishing their goal, whatever it is, and prevents them from defeating the antagonist. If your protagonist, or you're defeating the antagonist, if your protagonist is not flawed on page 1, the story is over. So when they overcome that story structuring flaw, that is what the theme grows out of. So for instance, if your character doesn't believe in themselves, the moment that they realize that they should, in fact, believe in themselves and that they can do this, that moment will reinforce a theme of the importance of believing in yourself. And then finally, the last dramatic element is the premise, where all of these get put together. And I'm going to move on to that in just a second. But first, I want to use Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone as an example. So we can't know for certain what J.K. Rowling's passion was when she wrote that manuscript, but we can deduce the theme. So I would love if you would type what you think the theme of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone is over in the chat. Good versus evil. Anyone else? Courage. So remember, this is the volume where Harry goes to Hogwarts for the very first time, and no one believes him when he is trying to convince them that the Sorcerer's Stone is at risk. We are who we choose to be, belonging, courage. These are all great. And if you think about the journey that Harry goes on, both physically and emotionally during that, you can see how these themes emerge from it. Learning who to accept who you are, the power is within, even if you don't realize it. Rebecca, yeah, I love that one. I think that that's really closely tied to what Harry's character flaw is in that first book, which is definitely a lack of self-confidence. You know, he's been relegated to this life in the cupboard under the stairs this whole time. And then finally at the end, when he believes in himself, that's when he's able to overcome Quirrell and Voldemort. So yeah, be yourself, acceptance, the power is within you. Those are all great themes. And his flaw is that lack of self-confidence. So some other really common character flaws out there. I think the number one most common character flaw is lack of self-confidence, which is doubt about one's abilities. And that's true no matter what genre you look at. It is so relatable because after all, who at one time or another has not lacked the confidence to do something? You know, whether it was academic or scholastic or personal, we've all been there. We've all lacked that self-confidence. So it really resonates with people, especially in middle grade and young adult genres, I would say. Two closely related but different flaws are lack of self-worth, which is doubt about one's value, and insecurity, which is doubt about one's situation. So lack of self-confidence is doubt about ability, lack of self-worth is doubt about value, and insecurity is a little less personal than either of those because it's doubt about your physical situation or your emotional situation. So you tend to see insecurity less than the other two. The other two are very common in middle grade and young adult. Insecurity, it is used. You just have to be a little bit careful to keep keep readers on the side of the protagonist throughout. Naivete, or not really understanding how the world works, is another very common story structuring flaw. It can be used really well in middle grade and young adult chapter books even as well. Two other closely related flaws that are often confused but actually produce different types of protagonists are inability to put the past behind and an inability to face the past. Now, if you think about Simba from The Lion King, which one of these flaws does he have? Does he have inability to put the past behind, or does he have an inability to face the past? What do you guys think? Type it over in the chat. Can't face from Iris. Yes, exactly. He can't face his past because he runs away from it. And so this creates the type of character who just refuses to think about it. Never happened, won't acknowledge it, won't deal with it. Whereas if you have a character who has an inability to put the past behind, on the complete opposite end of that spectrum, they ruminate, they dwell on it, they think about it constantly, they can't get over it. So even though they seem similar, they actually produce antithetical character types. Now, two other flaws that you can use for protagonists, but you need to be a little bit careful with because they can be unsympathetic, are prejudice and stubbornness. However, especially for prejudice, you can see how powerful it would be to see someone overcome that flaw. So if you choose to use one of those flaws for a protagonist, you just have to be careful that you make them sympathetic in other ways so that your audience and your readers don't get fed up with them for being bad people. So those are just two to be a little bit mindful of should you choose to use them. But now that we've established this list of character flaws, you can see how overcoming each one would build to a theme. And now if we tie all of these dramatic elements together, we come to the last, which is the premise. And this is a simple statement that encapsulates the kernel of what your story idea is. And this is where you want to start with every writing project that you ever work on, because if you ever start to get lost, you return to this. And this is what will be your guide for what fits and what doesn't in your story. And the template is, what if a flawed protagonist encounters some problem and has to overcome the flaw to solve the problem? Now, this isn't the greatest piece of writing out there. This is not anything that you will ever show a publisher, an agent. This is just for you. And so it may sound somewhat repetitive to have the flaw in there twice. But what this does is it emphasizes and reinforces how the flaw prevents the protagonist from solving the problem, and how it is only after they overcome that flaw that they are able to solve the problem and defeat the antagonist and be successful. And so this is relatively simple. And so there are lots of stories out there that have very similar premises. For instance, if I were to tell you, what if a young boy who lacked self-confidence encountered an evil Dark Lord and had to believe in himself in order to defeat the Dark Lord and save his world? I could be talking about Harry Potter. I could be talking about Star Wars. I could be talking of any number of books that are on the young adult and middle grade shelves out there. And that's fine. What it does for you is it emphasizes and makes you remember how you are supposed to be challenging that lack of self-confidence, and how it is only after that lack of self-confidence is overcome that then the protagonist can triumph. And so it is the next part that you build on that makes your story unique. And that's your 3-act structure. Now, this should look familiar to most of you from high school English class. You've got your 3 acts, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. It's been around since the ancient Greeks. You've got rising action, you have it peaking in the climax, and then resolving in Act 3. There's a reason this has been around that long. It works. However, this diagram isn't particularly helpful when you're trying to figure out what exactly is supposed to be happening in each of these acts. So at Writing Academy, what we've done is we have put 9 story structure checkpoints on top of this traditional 3-act structure graph that helps you see the arc that your protagonist is going through in each of the individual acts and how they all build together. Now, you'll also notice that we have updated this graph so that it is not a continuous line. It's actually kind of jagged going up in peaks. And the reason is that this is a more realistic look at what a manuscript looks like. So each peak is higher than the last, but there do have to be occasional respites for your protagonist and your readers to stop and reflect on what's been happening so that they can absorb the lessons and that change as well, so that there's not constant action throughout your manuscript. So you have these moments of relief where there's a slight release of tension, but then the next peak is higher, and then there's a release, and then the next peak is higher, and they still build up to the climax, which is, of course, your point of highest tension when the antagonist is ultimately defeated. So I want to walk you through each of these 9 story structure checkpoints. So if you have a story idea that you are already working on, I also encourage you to jot down some notes about how this might fit with your story, because this will be the beginning of what you need to plan for NaNoWriMo. All right, so Act 1. The first thing that happens in Act 1 is the hook. Now, the hook, as its name suggests, its job is to grab your reader's attention, to hook their interest. So it must do at least one of 2 things. It must raise a story question, and it must introduce your protagonist. Both of those things are essential. If you start with a character who's not your protagonist, you risk your readers bonding with the wrong person. And it's a really uphill battle to get them on the side of another character if they've already gotten interested in someone that then you pivot away from. So starting with your protagonist is very important, and making them ask at least one question, which is, it could be as simple as, what's happening here? That's often the question if you are familiar with the term in medias res, or in the middle of the action. So if you just drop your reader into the middle of a scene, they have to figure out what's going on, and so they're inclined to keep reading because they want to figure that out. You could choose to answer the story question right away, or in something like a mystery, you may not answer it until the very end of the manuscript. But it's that question that hooks readers and keeps them turning pages. So you want to start with some action, start with some dialogue, start with your protagonist to keep them interested. Then you transition into the backstory with a capital B. Now, this is not your protagonist's life history from birth up until page 1 of your manuscript. On the contrary, it is an opportunity to reveal some of that to introduce us to your character and their world, but it is also when we get to see a little bit of your protagonist's status quo, kind of what their everyday normal is. This is also where you can start to do your world building. This is especially important if you're writing something that is going to be unfamiliar to your readers. So that could, obviously be something like science fiction or fantasy where you're actually world building a new place, but it could also be if you're setting it in a culture or a time that your readers are going to be unfamiliar with. This is where you give the reader any information that is necessary for them to understand the events that will follow. You can continue to trickle out events from your character's past, other bits and pieces of knowledge like that through the entire course of your manuscript. So you don't have to dump it all into this section. It's just where the vital stuff go. We get to see a little bit of the character's everyday life, and then the events of the story kick off in the trigger. Now, this trigger that ends Act 1, it's not something that the protagonist does. It is something that happens to the protagonist, usually caused by the antagonist. And this trigger or event directly attacks the protagonist's flaw. So if it's lack of self-confidence, it puts them in a situation where they can only be successful if they believe in themselves. And this early in the story, they don't yet recognize that they lack self-confidence to begin with, and they certainly can't overcome it. And so what results is the beginning of Act 2, the crisis. And that crisis is a moment where the protagonist is completely overcome by their flaw. So the trigger is a moment of plot action, and the crisis is a moment of story reaction. It's them being unable to overcome their flaw, unable to even recognize what their character flaw is, and so they are unable to solve the problem, which launches them into the struggle, which makes up the bulk of Act 2, and honestly the bulk of most books. The struggle is usually the longest checkpoint. And this struggle is a series of increasingly dire plot complications and story complications that hammer away at the protagonist's flaw. Everything that's going wrong, every action the antagonist is taking is hammering away at whatever that flaw is, and they can't be successful because they don't know what it is yet and they haven't overcome it. And then finally, at the end of Act 2, after being just bombarded with every bad thing you can think of happening, the protagonist finally has their epiphany, which is a moment of internal story where they realize, eureka! All this time I have lacked self-confidence, and if only I believed in myself, I would be able to do X. Basically, they're realizing the second half of your premise in this moment, only more eloquently and better written than in your premise. Once they've had that epiphany, they're ready for Act 3. So Act 3 begins with the plan. And this plan is literally a plan that the protagonist puts together in order to achieve their goal and defeat the antagonist. And it is important that it must be something the protagonist could not do or could not successfully do prior to having their epiphany. That's why it comes after, because having had this self-realization and overcome it, they then are able to make a plan that works. It may take several plans. The first one may not work. Books that are heavy in action and adventure often have very long Act 3s because there are lots of plans, there's lots of plot twists and things like that are going on. But ultimately, they are successful, unless you're writing a tragedy. But they're successful and they get to the climax where the antagonist is defeated. And the antagonist also has a story structuring flaw, and they are unable to overcome their flaw, which is ultimately why they are defeated in the climax, and the protagonist, who has overcome the protagonist's flaw, is able to triumph over them. And then that leads you to the ending, where you wrap up relatively quickly because the tension has deflated from your manuscript as soon as the antagonist is defeated. So you don't want to go on for chapters and chapters and chapters after that point. You kind of want to bring it to its natural conclusion and let your characters ride off into their relative sunsets. So a couple of common questions people have about these acts and these checkpoints is, one, how long is an act? And the answer is it varies. And it kind of depends upon the needs of your story. So most often Act 2 is the longest. Act 3, like I mentioned, in an action adventure novel can be very long, or it can be very short. In a romance, the epiphany is often something along the lines of, I was wrong and I should apologize, which leads to the plan is apologize, and then things wrap up fairly quickly. So it just kind of depends on what genre you're writing, what needs to happen. So there's a great deal of flexibility. What's more important is the relative length of the checkpoints. So when it comes to checkpoints, those also vary. Some of them are very short. So the trigger, the crisis, and the epiphany are all short. The trigger is one plot event, the crisis is one emotional reaction, and the epiphany is one emotional reaction that is successful in overcoming what their flaw is. So those, it's important to keep tight. The rest of them are comprised of many, many scenes. And then the last question that I very commonly get is about prologues and epilogues. And I encourage authors to avoid them because they're usually an attempt to fix a fundamental story structuring problem that could have been better addressed at the beginning by having a strong 9-story structure checkpoint outline in place, especially if the prologue is delivering information that the protagonist does not have yet. I am firmly of the opinion that the reader should not have that information either, because it is much more affecting to be along for the ride with your protagonist and learn it along with them. That also means that you don't run the risk of the reader bonding with a character who is ultimately not your protagonist. If that is happening, even centuries before, you don't want to get them interested in someone only to then flash forward and be dealing with a different protagonist. All right. So I know that was a lot of information, but who feels like this is making sense? If you feel like it's making sense, go ahead and type a yes into the chat. Great, Marianne. I'm so glad. Awesome. Fantastic. Who is already feeling more confident about approaching NaNoWriMo? Type yes. Amazing, amazing. I've done my job. All right. Fantastic. I like that. Yes. Maurice, a wee bit. Okay. All right. I've got some more up my sleeve, Maurice. So, we'll keep going. All right. So outlines are amazing. And your 9-story structure checkpoints are the beginning of your outline. And the reason that I am such a proponent of outlines is because they give you so much flexibility once you actually start writing. And they give you a chance to solve tough story problems before you've written lots and lots of prose that you're really attached to. It is way easier to throw out a scene that you have in your mind when it's 2 lines in an outline than when it's 2 pages that you spent days crafting. So this is why I love outlines. Now, when it comes to NaNoWriMo, outlines are even more important, I think, for this increased flexibility. So when you are thinking about how you're going to approach NaNoWriMo this year, as a reminder, the goal is 50,000 words. And for some genres, that's a complete manuscript. So by the end of November, you could have draft 1 done. This is especially true for middle grade, but even young adult, 50,000 would be on the shorter end, but it's completely reasonable. But even if you're not done at 50,000 words, having an outline gives you so much more flexibility because you could start on page 1 and just write and keep going in chronological order. But what happens if you get stuck or you're not feeling inspired or something isn't really working? With an outline, you know each step of how you're supposed to get from beat to beat to beat to point to point to point. And so you could write in any order you wanted. You could write a chunk at the beginning and then you kind of get stuck and you're not really feeling this character or this scene, so you jump somewhere else. And 100,000 words might be a bit lengthy for a lot of you in the genres that you're writing. But just kind of for a nice round number, you can see how there's nothing in the rules about NaNoWriMo that the words have to be in order. So you can write different chunks. And so by having this big picture view of your 9-story structure checkpoints, you have the flexibility to write on whatever is inspiring you. And some people get really detailed with their outlines. I actually am one of those. I like to go scene by scene, basically like that. But even with the basic 9-story structure checkpoints, you have the ability to know where you're heading so that if you choose to jump around, you know how you'll have to connect those dots later. So again, success at NaNoWriMo really boils down to the preparation process, which happens now, coming up with that plan for both what and when you're going to write. And then it depends on executing that plan in November. And this brings me to how Writing Academy can help you do that. So we have our own November novel writing challenge that is a success course that is designed to help you get to a completed 50,000 word manuscript by the end of November. Because like I mentioned, this challenge defeats a lot of authors. And we want to make sure that you are successful at doing this because it's such an amazing opportunity to take time to in-depth commit to something and create these daily writing habits. And committing to something for 30 days, it's an achievable amount of time to spend that much time on, but it can create habits and you can continue those habits in a sustainable way for the rest of the year and succeed at all of your writing goals. So I just love that NaNoWriMo is this opportunity to, with a bunch of support, a bunch of other people who are all doing the same thing to coach you through it, to really take the time to, one, make progress on whatever project you're working on, but two, also create these habits that set you up for success in the long run. So NaNoWriMo is a free event. So you may be wondering, why would I enroll in a Writing Academy challenge? Well, I want to tell you that during NaNoWriMo, we want you to do three things. We want you to write, which of course you can do anywhere, but we also want you to learn. And I hope that the last 50 minutes that we've spent together have started to show you how much there is out there to learn, and all of the stuff that you also do on your daily basis with your projects. And then finally, we also want you to win, because we think that writing 50,000 words is an accomplishment that's worth more than just bragging rights. So our Nano Success class goes like this. Every week, new lessons and discussion areas open up, and the focus is really on inspiration and community. So the core components are a video lesson that reinforce or introduce a new writing topic for you, and then the discussion areas where you can join me and your fellow NaNoWriMo challengers in the discussion area to share advice, struggles, inspiration, tips for success. Like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the writing sprints is something that came out of last year's NaNoWriMo challenge for Writing Academy. It was great, and it helped a lot of students who were struggling because of that perception of needing the big time blocks. So it's really great if you have a place with writers who are on the same page as you are. I think is what's really important, is that you're working with similar materials, you're working with similar ideologies, and so it's easier to support one another in one of our discussion areas. So the first week is actually a preparatory week. And I know that I flew through a lot of the material tonight. So this goes into more detail about the dramatic elements using examples from published works. It digs deeper into each of the three acts, again, using examples, and also introduces something that is a huge light bulb moment for many authors, myself included, which is the concept of scene and sequel. And as a brief spoiler, basically scene boils down to the plot, and sequel boils down to the emotional reaction to it. And so not only is there a constant interplay between plot and story, but it's played out in this interplay between scene and sequel, scene and sequel, scene and sequel, so that there are literally hundreds of scene and sequel pairs in a manuscript. But it's a great tool for improving the quality of your writing. So with that under your belt, you're ready to begin the challenge in week one, where we then talk about things that are necessary for you to either choose or think about right up front. For instance, the tense and point of view that you're going to be writing your manuscript in have big impacts. Your protagonist will go into more details about how to develop them and make them three-dimensional. And we'll also talk about the antagonist, which we didn't have a lot of time to chat about tonight, and go into how the story structuring flaw for the antagonist can be related to the protagonists, and how that can emphasize your theme even more. In week two, we choose topics that are probably going to be where you've had sticking points in week one. Things like getting your character voices down, or writing natural dialogue, talking about how to write good settings. In NaNoWriMo, there's a tendency to just like put a whole bunch of adjectives together, but that's not necessarily the best way to create a fully realized session, or a fully realized place. Sonia, I see, just asked how long will the lessons last? So these video lessons, we know that you want to spend most of your time, your valuable time, in November writing. So the video lessons themselves aren't short. It's intended to be inspirational and a reminder. We offer other writing workshops that go into them in much more detail, but you'll hit the highlights of kind of what you really need to know as you're going through NaNoWriMo, without taking too much time away. So we really want you to be absorbing and being inspired by the videos, but time that you're spending with us, we would love for you to be in the discussion areas, exchanging each other, and then obviously writing. But the discussion area is also a great place for you to come if you are feeling stuck, or you need some advice, or want to bounce something off one of your fellow students. So we're not taking up tons of your time with these video lessons during November, because you have other things that you will be doing. Week three, you're halfway there. So in this point, we will deal with specific techniques for conflict and suspense and mystery. How to incorporate those into your writing, you'll be more than halfway there. And so these are things that can help you feel inspired, new things that you can try to keep your momentum going throughout the month. In week 4, we scale back a little bit on the videos and mostly allow you time to write because this is when the crunch time is coming in. But we will talk about techniques for how to write big, which is improving the big picture quality of your writing, and then how to write well, which is making sure that it's polished and professional. And then there's a hefty dose of inspiration that is given at the end of that. And then finally, in week 5, you cross the finish line. And I think one of the most important things about this course is that on December 1st, we deal with what comes next. Because of course, completing the 50,000 word manuscript is a huge accomplishment, but it's no good if it just sits there on your hard drive gathering proverbial computer dust. You need to do something with it. So we'll talk about that process as well and what you do after the challenge is over and how you keep, sustain in a sustainable way the momentum that you've built up in November in order to accomplish these goals. And like I mentioned earlier, the most important reason to join Writing Academy in November is that we believe that writing 50,000 words is an accomplishment that is worth more than just bragging rights. So if you join us and complete the challenge in November, you will get a free 30-minute personal consultation to talk about your manuscript with me. So during that consultation, we can talk about anything you want. We can talk about your story's structure. We can talk about specific challenges you're facing. We can help you come up with a publishing, marketing plan, whatever stage you're at. You can use this personal consultation to launch you into the next phase of your development. Karen wants to know about turning in the manuscripts or completing the 50,000 words. I will tell you a little bit more about that actually in just a moment because there will also be one grand prize winner. And so one student who completes the 50,000 words will win a professional Writing Academy critique, which means that we will evaluate your entire completed manuscript using the core principles that our courses teach. And you've gotten a little bit of a sample of that tonight in terms of story structure, but we will also evaluate things like character development and viewpoint and dialogue and give you, we'll point out where you've done well, and we'll also point out where there are opportunities for improvement. And so what we'll do is after we've looked at your complete manuscript, we will type up essay style feedback for you and send it to you. And after you've had a chance to sort of look it over, look at your manuscript again, go over any questions, then we'll set up time one-on-one to go over the feedback with you so that you can discuss anything you have questions about. We can talk through anything and again, help you make a plan for how to supercharge your rewrites after November is complete. And so that prize value is worth $1,200. So that will go to one student who completes the challenge, but every student who completes the challenge gets the personal consultation. So Karen, to answer your question about the manuscript, if you are interested in submitting your manuscript for the grand prize, we will need a copy of your manuscript as part of that submission process. However, if you are just interested in the personal consultation, a screenshot of your word count on NaNoWriMo or in your word processor of choice is a completely acceptable way to answer that. This is really about setting you up for success. So, we're very flexible. If you write the 50,000 words, we want to see you succeed. So even if you're working on a project that's something like maybe a chapter book that's much shorter than 50,000 words, if you want to write a chapter book series, by all means, we consider that fair game for this. So the Writing Academy Success Challenge is normally $99, but as a special thank you for being here tonight, you can enroll for just $49. However, because of the personal attention that is required for these consultations and the grand prize winner, the enrollment in our success course is capped. So I encourage you not to wait and enroll today. And you can do so at writingacademy.com/P/WBP. And I would actually love it if someone could type that in. And you know what? I will also go ahead and post it into the chat over here for anybody who wants to copy and paste it. But I want to make sure that this link is working before I start answering questions. So could somebody go and type a yes if this link is working? This is where you can sign up for the Writing Academy November Novel Writing Challenge. And as soon as we make sure that that link is up and running, then I would love to open it up for questions. Sharon, thank you. Perfect. I am so glad to hear that that is working. All right. So now that we're kind of at the end of this, who's feeling good about NaNoWriMo? Who feels like they're ready to commit to taking this step forward in your writing dreams? Type a yes over in the chat if you're ready. Amazing, Sonia. Leon, amazing. Great. Amanda. Rebecca, feeling nervous is totally normal, but I'm glad to hear that you're ready to go. And Sharon, I'm glad that you're feeling inspired. This is a really great challenge. I love it. I think it's a great opportunity for people to really commit to something and make a huge amount of progress on something. And every word you write in NaNoWriMo, even if you're not sure you can write the 50,000, every word you write is a step forward, and you just take it one day at a time. Yeah, Jan, chapter book series. This is a great time to do it. All right, if you've got Rebecca wants to know if 50,000 is too short for YA, what would be the appropriate word count? The answer on word counts is always a little bit iffy because it depends a little bit on what you intend to do with it. If you want to get it traditionally published, publishers usually have stricter guidelines. Off the top of my head, I want to say that young adult is 60 to 100,000, might be 80 to 100,000. I'm always a little fuzzy on these. But I don't love to give word count like definitive answers because it should really be as long as the story is. So I think you could write a young adult novel that felt complete in 50,000 words and was marketable. You might be a little safer towards 60. Deborah, I'm glad that you feel inspired. Rebecca also wants to know, how would one go about writing if they wanted to write using a pen name, a nom de plume? That's pretty easy. So yeah, so you can do that on Amazon. You obviously have to give them your real name for the financial side of things, but you can publish under any name that you like for the author, and the readers won't be able to see that. So that's something you can totally do. What other questions do you guys have about story structure in general? Thanks for joining us, Diane. I really appreciate it. All right, Iris, you have actually asked a question that is something that we talk about, because you ask, should you edit after the manuscript is complete? And yes, the answer is do not edit during the month of November. And that's something that we talk about in the class, because you don't want to get sidetracked. You want to keep your forward momentum going. And once you get to the end of the challenge, or preferably the end of your first draft, that's when it's time for editing. The class begins October 24th, so it's coming up. And one other thing, this $49 offer is good through Saturday at midnight, or until the class fills up, whichever happens first. Rebecca wants to know if it would be best to submit to an editor before submitting to an agent. It kind of depends. If you can confidently edit your own work, it's probably okay to query an editor without or query an agent without hiring an editor first, but it can be a confidence boost. Not necessary. Do your research, I would say, if you're going to invest in an editor. Definitely hire an editor if you're going to self-publish. But if you're querying an agent, as long as it's professional and consistent, they kind of know that that's a step that happens later. What if you're in the middle of a book and won't be able to start the 50K on the, well, okay, so Maurice, you can still participate in the challenge even if you are already working on a book. Nothing says you have to start at the beginning. So if you have 50,000 words in you left to write in that book, you can still do it. So yeah, just 50,000 words during the month of November. If you're thinking that it's going to wrap up before that, but you would be starting another book during the month, shoot me an email at dani@writingacademy.com. That's DANI@writingacademy.com. And let's talk, because I would be willing to say that that counted for the personal consultation part of our challenge. Rebecca, I'm not familiar with DBA, doing business as for copyright. Yeah, if you can tell me a little bit more about that, maybe I can answer it. Laura says, I'm great at editing other people, not myself. Does the course go there? We don't spend too much time talking about the actual process of editing until the end of the course because we encourage you not to do it. However, my 2 cents for that, because I also fall into that category of I'm very good at editing other people's work and I'm less good at my own, is to put it away for as long as you can, really, whether that's a few days, a few weeks, or even a couple of months. If you come back to it with fresh eyes, it is often a lot easier because you no longer remember exactly what it was you intended to say or write. Because that's what I do, is that I know what I meant, and so I miss typos because I know that there was supposed to be a to there, and my brain just fills it in. If I put it away for, even a couple of hours, if it's something short like an email or a blog post or something like that, and come back to it, I'm usually a lot better at that. Sonia, yes, people are very successful when they self-publish their own novels. It's a completely viable path for a lot of authors. Traditional publishers no longer have the budgets they used to for marketing, and so you're still required to do a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to marketing and promoting your book anyway. So if you self-publish your book, you make a lot more per copy, although of course you don't get an advance like you do with some publishers. So it's definitely, there are pros and cons both ways, but I do definitely believe that for many authors, self-publishing is the better business plan. Marianne says that the checkout price is still $99. Does the discount come off after checkout? Let me just double check that link real fast because it should be applied. Yeah, if you look over on the right-hand side, it should say that your total is $49. And it should reflect a $50 discount if you follow the link through the Enroll Now page from the writingacademy.com/P/WBP. Thanks, Amy. Good luck to the 7th graders. I think that's really great. Yeah, I think it's a great challenge for students too. What other questions can I answer for you all tonight? Hi, Karen. I'll double check on that on my end, and if that's the case, I'll refund the $50 for you. Rebecca wants to know how long the novel writing process is once you've finished a nano novel. That's a great question. I think it varies author to author. If you're able to sustain the same pace that you work at with NaNoWriMo, it will obviously go a lot faster. Yeah, Rebecca, the free NaNoWriMo, all you have to do is go to nanowrimo.org and sign up there. So that's totally separate from Writing Academy's November challenge. We're just to complement that. So yeah, you just create a login there. But yeah, to go back to how long the novel writing process is once you finished it. One, it depends on whether or not 50,000 words is close to your finished manuscript total or not. So for a lot of you, I'm guessing that it probably is, which means that you could probably finish up the first draft of your manuscript comfortably in like December. Take a little break for the holidays, and then you have the revision process. So it also depends. My experience and with Writing Academy students is that if you go in with the 9-story structure checkpoints and an outline, you have a lot less heavy lifting to do during the revision process. So I think that that can usually go relatively quickly. I would say that it would be completely achievable to have the book completed and ready either for self-publishing or to query traditional publishers in the first half of 2020. Maurice wants to know what should go into a chapter outline. Definitely joining the course. Outlining is a very personal thing. So for me, what I usually do is I put a heading in for each of the scenes that I envision. And when I say scene like that, I'm talking about like movie scenes, like when you're in one location. They could actually be comprised of many scene and sequel pairs, which you'll see in the course when we talk about that lesson. And then I'll usually start with a few lines of description about like where they are and what's happening. But then as I write, I like hear bits and pieces of dialogue. And so I sort of use my outline as also a place to jot stuff like that down and keep notes so it's all in one spot. So my outlines are a little bit messy, but I find them helpful because I'm like, oh yeah, that was a great one-liner, or this was a great conversation. And occasionally I'll even write like a whole little paragraph or a snippet of something if it just pops into my head, and then incorporate that into the manuscript later on. But different writers kind of work differently. So it takes a little bit of, experimentation to find what works for you. I find success with the longer outline. Some people will literally just write a single line just to remind them what they were thinking of. So. Other questions? Rebecca wants to know about DBA. I did not see that, but I will scroll up, see if I can find it. If not, send me an email at Dani, D-A-N-I, at writingacademy.com, and I'll make sure to get an answer. I think I found it. I happened to look at DBA as a legal way to form a copyright under a different name. Is that correct? Oh, this is related to the nom de plume question. I actually am not familiar with that, so I would need to do a little bit of research and get back to you in terms of how to copyright under a different name as well. Do I have a favorite word processing program? Laura asks. I do, actually, and I use Apple Pages because I self-publish Writing Academy works and my own as well, and it's really powerful for editing without having to pay for book editing software. It's pretty similar to Microsoft Word, so I think that for a first draft, you really can't go wrong, whatever your word processing software is of choice. There are people out there who really like programs like Scrivener that have built-in tools for writers to use, like sort of souped-up editing or souped-up outlining features, like that look like little cards that you can tack up and things like that. Personally, I've never found that to be very helpful, but I do know writers who love those features. I'm kind of old school with my outlines. I literally just use the outline function in Word or Pages or whatever. Iris wants to know if you have to know the ending when you start, and I would argue that yes, you do have to know at least roughly what the ending is and where the story concludes before you start writing, because if you do that work during the outline phase, you won't ever write yourself into a corner. You won't have to throw away text that you've slaved over because it no longer fits with the direction that you took the manuscript in. So I think if you treat the outlining phase as just as creative as the writing phase, you save yourself a lot of work in the long run. Yeah, Laura, if you got a used Mac, I probably will have Pages on there. So I recommend checking that out. If you're used to Word, it should be a very easy transition process. Other questions? Anything else I can answer for you guys tonight? All right. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your Tuesday to join me. I hope to see you in Writing Academy's November Novel Writing Challenge. And I would love to hear more about what you're working on. Yes, Linda, there is a replay of this that will be available. It'll go out a couple of hours after we end here. So again, remember that the $49 enrollment in the Writing Academy Challenge lasts until Saturday at midnight. So please, visit writingacademy.com/p/WBP to enroll in that. And it was a pleasure being here this evening. I hope you are all inspired to participate in NaNoWriMo, whether or not you join us in the Writing Academy Challenge. And I will leave you with Writing Academy's traditional send-off, which is happy writing.